Brazil has officially banned their version of Donald Trump, former President Jair Bolsonaro, from running for office until 2030 because they found that he abused his power while in office and spread unfounded lies about the election system. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So some of you may recall that earlier in the year we did a couple of videos about Brazil because they experienced a very disturbing parallel to the United States in the final days of the Trump administration. So until last year, Brazil had been under the command of Jair Bolsonaro, who is a right-wing narcissist and authoritarian, much like Donald Trump. And much like Donald Trump, in the lead up to the presidential election, he was spreading unfounded lies and trying to sabotage the attempt of his progressive opponent, Lula da Silva, who was himself a former president of Brazil, and basically doing everything in his power to undermine the effort to question the legitimacy of the elections. There were even some degree of evidence that he was looking to potentially stage a coup and weaponize the military and things like that. So the election came. It was in, I think, October, November of 2022. Bolsonaro lost, and for about a week, he refused to comment as to whether or not he lost and whether or not he would concede. Unlike Trump, he did, about a week later, officially begin the process of the transition, but I don't think he ever actually formally conceded. So that was in November 2022. Flash forward to January 2023, when the transition would occur and Lula da Silva would take Bolsonaro's place as president of Brazil. And about a week after that, Bolsonaro's supporters stormed the Brazilian capital, Brasilia, and attacked the headquarters of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch in the Brazilian capital in their own version of January 6th. Now, you may recall in the videos that we discussed, I said that Brazil was taking a much more aggressive and proactive and unapologetically pro-democratic approach. And what I meant was Lula da Silva, the president, after the insurrection was put down or the Capitol riots were put down, he vowed publicly that there would be consequences for not only the insurrectionists, but the people who stirred them up. He fired certain executives who were Bolsonaro appointees that he believed either aided and abetted or allowed the Capitol riots to take place. The Brazilian Supreme Court announced immediately that they would investigate multiple of figures in the Bolsonaro regime and Bolsonaro himself, that he would be formally investigated. And this was all in a matter of weeks. Weeks! You think about it in the context of the United States, and the contrast is stark. But it gets better, folks. So the Brazilian judicial system has officially banned Jair Bolsonaro, their version of Donald Trump, from running for office again until 2030. He is no longer eligible to be in a position of power in Brazil for another 7 years. And I don't think that's the end of the consequences, so let's read. A majority of judges on the top election court in Brazil voted to ban former President Jair Bolsonaro from seeking office again until 2030 for making claims, the court says, were false about the country's voting systems. So please know, this doesn't even have anything to do with his potential involvement in inciting an insurrection or an attempted coup back in January against Lula da Silva. That's separate. That's an ongoing investigation. This is merely about his abuse of power while in office in the lead up to the election and spreading lies about the Brazilian election system, which is kind of what Donald Trump did. Actually, no, it's not even kind of. It is absolutely what Donald Trump did when Trump was president in 2020. The 7-judge panel found the right-wing populace guilty of abuse of power for allegedly undermining the country's democracy while in office. Bolsonaro was voted out of office in 2022 after losing election to President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva by a narrow margin. Bolsonaro is a close political ally of former U.S. President Donald Trump, who endorsed him in his re-election bid, earning him the nickname Tropical Trump. The Brazilian president is being investigated in multiple criminal cases. That's unfair to me, for God's sake, he says, Jair Bolsonaro told reporters on Thursday. Show me something concrete that I did against democracy. I played within the bounds of the Constitution the whole time. If the ruling is upheld by the country's Supreme Court, Bolsonaro will not be eligible to run for president until he's 75 and would be sidelined from politics for the remainder of the decade. The trial only lasted a week and no witnesses were called to testify. The legal proceedings mostly included statements by the various justices and brief comments from Bolsonaro's defense team. So, guys, this is pretty, I don't want to say severe, but this is a very blunt condemnation of what Jair Bolsonaro did. it's fitting, of course, that he's complaining impotently from the sidelines. And note that he's unapologetic. In his mind, listen, telling lies about Brazilian's election system, that's playing within the rules of the Constitution. It's disgusting. It's a disgusting excuse. And here at Pondering Politics, we cover mostly domestic political issues. But the reason I'm bringing this up is, again, the stark contrast. The approach that the Brazilian government, its executive branch, its legislative branch, its judicial branches, all three of them, are taking to Jair Bolsonaro and the attempted insurrection by Bolsonaro supporters compared to how the United States has handled it. So we did a story recently where it was discovered that, unfortunately, the Biden Justice Department under Attorney General Merrick Garland and FBI Director Christopher Wray slow-walked multiple early investigations into Donald Trump and his inner circle out of fear that they would be perceived as partisan. It was a different kind of political consideration. They weren't looking to be overtly political on behalf of an ally. They were giving an undue line of credit, benefit of the doubt, and slack to a political opponent because they were afraid that by pursuing those leads, that opponent's supporters would tar and feather the American justice system and the Justice Department as being partisan. Brazil has taken a much more aggressive and contradictory approach. Now, what they're saying is, we don't care what you call us. Yes, you're entitled to due process, but we recognize this for the threat it is. And we're going to pursue the facts wherever they may lead. And if that puts us in the uncomfortable position of ruthlessly punishing a former leader, then so be it, because nobody is above the law. That is the posture, in my opinion, that the United States should have. Now, to be clear, Brazil's judicial system, its Supreme Court, and its just court system in general, is a bit different than the United States because one of their courts actually has investigatory power. They can proactively, they're not merely just judges. They can actually proactively investigate certain things, particularly with respect to elections. The court system in Brazil is intimately involved in democratic elections in Brazil, in a way that the United States Supreme Court isn't, because in the United States Supreme Court, you have to bring a case before the Supreme Court. You have to, file a federal case, get standing, make your way up through the various appellate structure, and then potentially get in front of the Supreme Court. But the bottom line is this. The U.S. should have taken a posture as similar to Brazil's as possible, and I suspect that Brazil has looked at the United States and how we have been so slow to handle Trump. Now, granted, we see what Jack Smith is doing now. He's snapping necks and cashing checks, as people say. He's making aggressive progress, but he's on a time crunch, right? Donald Trump is running for president. Nothing that Jack Smith has currently indicted him for would prevent Trump from not only running for president, but becoming president again. So had Merrick Garland and Christopher Wray allowed investigators to pursue these, the factual predicates to these investigations early on, instead of just wringing their hands oh my gosh, we don't want to be seen as partisan. We can't do that. We just got to hope that maybe if we just kind of slow walk this, we won't have to pursue an investigation, and maybe the Republican Party will eventually learn to trust us again. No. I mean, and of course, that's the sad thing. Not only did we lose time, but we lost time for nothing, because the Republican Party still distrusts the Department of Justice, because, again, it's an authoritarian cult of personality. There's no timeline in which the Justice Department could ever indict Donald Trump in a way that the vast and overwhelming majority of Republicans would accept it. Donald Trump called this, for all his stupidity. He reads his cult better than anybody. He has the measure of them. And he said famously years ago, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose a single vote. That is factually the case. And I wish that Christopher Wray and Merrick Garland and even President Biden had understood that very early on. And it seems like Brazil, with Jair Bolsonaro, they recognize that. And so they're not even bothering to, cut him some slack or whatever. He's entitled to the bare minimum due process, and otherwise, justice and the wheels of justice are going to turn just as they would with anybody else. I love that posture. Hopefully this will inspire the United States moving forward with respect to Trump and other Trump wannabes.